The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a mechanical heartbeat. In the witness chair sat a man in a wheelchair, his hands motionless in his lap, his voice barely above a whisper. Across the courtroom, another man in an expensive suit stared straight ahead, his face a mask of practiced indifference. Between them stretched 20 feet of polished wood and carpet, but the real distance was measured in trust shattered, lives forever altered, and a friendship that had become something unrecognizable. This is the space where consequences live, where the abstract weight of professional responsibility becomes flesh and bone and tears, where someone who once took an oath to do no harm must face the people whose lives were forever changed by his hands. In courtrooms like this one, justice doesn't arrive with fanfare or dramatic music. It comes quietly in the form of testimony that cannot be undone, evidence that speaks louder than any defense, and the terrible mathematics of what happens when the person you trusted most becomes the architect of your deepest suffering. Some betrayals cut so deep they reshape the very foundation of how we understand safety, expertise, and the sacred trust we place in those who promise to heal us. The gavel fell on a February morning in Dallas, and with it, a chapter closed on one of the most disturbing cases in American medical history. But the real story wasn't found in the verdict itself. It was found in the faces of those who had come to bear witness. This dramatized narrative is inspired by real legal principles and public case records. It is presented for educational and entertainment purposes, with interpretations attributed to their respective sources. The courthouse steps were slick with morning frost when Christopher Dunch arrived for what would become the most significant medical malpractice trial in modern American legal history. He walked with the confident stride of someone who had spent years commanding operating rooms, his shoulders straight, his expression controlled. But inside courtroom 219, a different kind of surgery was about to begin, one where he would not be holding the scalpel. This wasn't supposed to be possible. In the carefully regulated world of medical practice, doctors faced licensing boards, hospital reviews, and civil lawsuits. Criminal prosecution for actions taken in the operating room was virtually unheard of. The medical establishment had built walls of professional courtesy, peer review, and benefit of the doubt that stretched back generations. Those walls had protected countless physicians from the harsh light of criminal scrutiny, but Christopher Dunch had done something that no amount of professional protection could shield. He had crossed a line that most people didn't even know existed until they found themselves on the wrong side of it. The prosecution's case would center on one victim, Mary Eford, but her story was just the tip of something much darker. Behind her wheelchair sat the faces of others who had trusted this man with their most precious possession, their lives, their mobility, their future. The irony was surgical in its precision. The very qualities that made someone a successful surgeon, confidence, decisiveness, the ability to cut into human flesh without hesitation, could become weapons when guided by something other than healing. District Attorney's Office had spent months preparing for this moment. They knew they were attempting something unprecedented, to prove that a licensed physician trained at prestigious institutions, certified by medical boards, had intentionally caused harm to the people who had placed their complete trust in him. The challenge wasn't just legal, it was philosophical. How do you separate incompetence from malice? How do you prove intent when the defendant's entire professional identity was built around the presumption of healing? How do you convince 12 jurors that someone who had sworn the Hippocratic Oath had systematically violated its most fundamental principle? The answer lay in the evidence. Box after box of medical records, surgical notes, and witness testimony that would paint a picture so disturbing that even the most generous interpretation of professional error would crumble under its weight. Mary Eford had walked into Dallas Medical Center on a routine morning, suffering from chronic back pain that had made her daily life increasingly difficult. She was 74 years old, a grandmother who had lived through decades of life's ordinary challenges. The surgery was supposed to be straightforward, a spinal fusion to alleviate her discomfort and restore her quality of life. She would never walk normally again. The operation that was meant to heal her had instead become something closer to systematic destruction. When other surgeons were called in to assess the damage, they found devastation that defied medical explanation. Critical structures had been damaged, hardware placed in impossible positions, and injuries inflicted that seemed to demonstrate either breathtaking incompetence or something far more sinister. Dr. Robert Henderson, the neurosurgeon brought in to attempt repairs, would later testify that the damage was so extensive and so precisely wrong that it suggested knowledge. You cannot accidentally destroy so many things in exactly the wrong way unless you understand how they're supposed to work in the first place. As you listen, notice how easily this could be anyone's life. Any of us placing our trust in someone whose credentials and authority seem beyond question. But Mary Effort's case was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a trail of medical devastation that stretched across multiple hospitals and dozens of patients. The pattern wasn't random, it was systematic. Jerry Summers had been Dunch's childhood friend. They had grown up together, shared dreams and memories that stretched back decades. When Summers needed spinal surgery after a car accident, there was no question about who he would trust with the procedure. His oldest friend, someone he had known since they were boys. The surgery left Summers a quadriplegic. The betrayal cut deeper than the medical injury itself. This wasn't a stranger making a mistake. This was someone who had been invited into the most intimate circle of trust. Someone who had shared birthday parties and family dinners and the accumulated intimacy of a lifetime friendship. In his video testimony played from his home in Memphis, Summers spoke with the measured cadence of someone who has had years to process an incomprehensible reality. His voice was steady, but his eyes held the particular sadness of someone whose trust had been weaponized against him. The harness around his neck allowed him to control his wheelchair with subtle head movements. Hardware near his ears gave him limited ability to make adjustments to his environment. The man who had once run and played and embraced life with the casual confidence of someone who assumed his body would always obey his will now navigated the world through a complex system of mechanical assistance. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of his testimony wasn't the description of his physical limitations. It was the quiet dignity with which he spoke about his former friend. Even after everything, even after his life had been fundamentally altered, there was no anger in his voice. Just a profound sadness for what had been lost. The courtroom fell silent as his testimony played. Jurors looked down at their hands. Spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. And at the defendant's table, Christopher Dunch maintained the same expression of controlled professionalism he had worn since the trial began. The prosecution's strategy was methodical. They would establish not just that harm had occurred, but that it had occurred in ways that defied explanation through ordinary negligence. They brought in expert witnesses who walked the jury through normal surgical procedures step by step, showing how each operation should have proceeded and exactly where things had gone catastrophically wrong. Dr. Martin Lazar, a respected neurosurgeon, provided testimony that cut through the technical details to address something more fundamental. His assessment wasn't just about surgical technique. It was about the complete absence of the empathy and caution that defined responsible medical practice. The patients, he testified, had been treated not as human beings deserving care and protection, but as objects to be manipulated. The pattern of injuries suggested someone who understood human anatomy well enough to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The defense faced an impossible task. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you explain away evidence so overwhelming that it spoke for itself? How do you ask a jury to believe that someone trained in the most precise and careful of medical arts had simply made a series of unfortunate mistakes? Their strategy relied on the fundamental assumption that had protected the medical profession for generations. Doctors make mistakes. Surgery is inherently risky. Complications happen even to the most skilled practitioners. Sometimes outcomes are tragic despite everyone's best efforts. But this case had moved beyond the realm where such explanations could hold weight. The evidence was too systematic, too precise in its destruction, too consistent across multiple patients and multiple hospitals. The morning light filtered through hospital windows like hope through gauze. In rooms across the country, people were making the same quiet calculation that had been made for generations. The decision to trust, to place their most precious possession, their body, their future, into the hands of someone who had promised to heal. This is the mathematics of vulnerability, the moment when expertise meets desperation, when credentials collide with faith, and when the white coat becomes either a shield or a weapon. In operating rooms everywhere, this transaction happens thousands of times each day. The patient closes their eyes, the surgeon lifts the scalpel, and somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness, between before and after, the world can change forever. Some betrayals are so profound they redefine not just individual lives, but the very institutions we trust to protect us. The witness chair had become a confession booth. One by one, they rolled in wheelchairs, walked with canes, spoke in whispers that barely carried across the courtroom. Each carried the same invisible burden. They had trusted someone who wore the uniform of healing and found themselves forever changed by that decision. This dramatized narrative is inspired by real legal principles and public case records. It is presented for educational and entertainment purposes, with interpretations attributed to their respective sources. The prosecution knew they were attempting something that existed at the very edges of legal precedent. Criminal prosecution of a physician for actions taken in the operating room was virtually unknown in American jurisprudence. The medical establishment had constructed elaborate systems of protection, peer review, professional courtesy, the assumption that even catastrophic outcomes could be explained by the inherent risks of surgery. But the evidence they had assembled told a different story, not of risk, not of unfortunate complications, but of something that challenged the fundamental assumptions about professional responsibility and the sacred trust between healer and patient. Jackie Troy took the witness stand with the measured steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world differently. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper, not from shyness or fear, but because her vocal cords had been permanently damaged during what should have been routine neck surgery. She described waking up in recovery to find that something fundamental had been altered, not just in her body, but in her understanding of safety itself. The surgery had left her esophagus pinned under hardware that had been placed with surgical precision in exactly the wrong location. The infection that followed had nearly killed her. But perhaps more devastating was the realization that the person she had trusted with her life had treated her body as something disposable, something to be practiced on, rather than healed. Her testimony lasted less than an hour, but its impact rippled through the courtroom like aftershocks. Here was someone who would never again speak above a whisper, whose every conversation would be marked by the permanent consequences of someone else's choices. The defense attorney's cross-examination was gentle, almost apologetic. How do you aggressively question someone whose injury speaks louder than any words? How do you suggest that catastrophic harm was simply an unfortunate outcome when the evidence suggests systematic negligence? Philip Mayfield brought a different kind of devastation to the witness stand. His injury wasn't visible in the traditional sense. No wheelchair, no obvious limitation. But chronic pain had become his constant companion, stealing moments that should have belonged to joy. He described missing his son's football games because the pain would cause him to lose consciousness without warning. Birthday parties abandoned halfway through. Family vacations cut short. A life measured not in achievements or happiness, but in the careful management of unrelenting discomfort. The mathematical precision of his suffering was heartbreaking. Pain levels measured on scales from 1 to 10. Medications that provided temporary relief, but never true healing. Sleep interrupted by sensations that defied description but never ceased. His testimony revealed something that the medical profession rarely acknowledges, that some injuries transcend the physical and become existential. They don't just change what you can do, they change who you are. Barry Morgulov entered the courtroom with a brace and a cane, each step a careful negotiation with a body that no longer followed his commands. The nerve damage in his spine had left him with a permanent limp and the constant awareness that his mobility existed at the mercy of surgical decisions made by someone else. But his testimony focused less on his physical limitations and more on something harder to quantify. The loss of confidence in his own body, the way chronic pain had altered his relationship with the future, the careful choreography required to navigate daily life when you can never be certain your body will cooperate. As you listen, notice how easily this could be anyone's life, any routine procedure, any morning when you wake up trusting that the medical system exists to protect rather than harm you. The medical expert testimony transformed the courtroom into an anatomy lesson. Dr. Robert Henderson, the surgeon called in to repair the damage from multiple botched procedures, walked the jury through the precise geography of human spinal anatomy. Vertebrae, nerve bundles, the delicate architecture that allows us to walk, to feel, to move through the world with unconscious grace. But his testimony went beyond technical explanation. He described finding damage so systematically comprehensive that it challenged his assumptions about surgical error. Holes drilled in wrong locations, hardware placed with precision in positions that would guarantee harm. Structures damaged in ways that suggested not incompetence but knowledge weaponized against healing. The most chilling aspect of his testimony wasn't the description of the injuries themselves, but his professional assessment of their systematic nature. This wasn't someone making mistakes. This was someone who understood human anatomy well enough to cause maximum damage while maintaining the appearance of attempting to heal. Dr. Henderson had spent decades in operating rooms. He had seen complications, errors, and tragic outcomes that haunted him for years. But he had never encountered anything like the systematic destruction he found in case after case. The precision of the harm suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. The prosecution's strategy was building toward a single, devastating conclusion. This wasn't malpractice in the traditional sense. This wasn't even gross negligence. This was something that existed in a category by itself: the deliberate transformation of healing into harm. Dr. Martin Lazar's testimony cut through medical jargon to address something more fundamental. His assessment wasn't just about surgical technique. It was about the complete absence of the empathy and caution that should define medical practice. He described a pattern of behavior that treated patients not as human beings deserving protection, but as objects to be manipulated. The injuries suggested someone who had lost all connection to the fundamental purpose of medicine, someone who had transformed the operating room from a place of healing into something unrecognizable. His words carried the weight of professional authority, but also personal revulsion. Here was a respected surgeon forced to acknowledge that someone within his profession had violated every principle that made medical practice sacred. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The verdict wasn't just about one man or one case. It was about whether the sacred trust between healer and patient still meant something in a world where credentials could mask systematic harm, life in prison. The first surgeon in American history to be criminally convicted for actions taken in the operating room. The gavel fell, but the echo would resonate through medical institutions for generations to come. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled to make sense of a verdict that challenged fundamental assumptions about medical accountability. Inside, victims and their families sat in wheelchairs and walked with canes, finally witnessing consequences that matched the magnitude of their suffering. But perhaps the most profound impact wasn't found in the courtroom at all. It was in operating rooms across the country where the unthinkable had become precedent, where the assumption of professional immunity had been shattered by the weight of evidence too overwhelming to ignore. The shadow behind justice isn't found in verdicts or sentences. It's found in the quiet moments when trust rebuilds itself, one careful choice at a time. When someone decides to believe in healing again, despite everything they've witnessed about its potential for harm. This was the day the medical profession learned that even the most sacred oaths can be broken. And sometimes the only way to restore faith in healing is to hold healers accountable for the harm they cause.